East of the sun and west of the moon, we'll build a dream house of love, dear, close to the sun every day, near to the moon at night. We'll live in a lovely way, dear, sharing our love by the pale moonlight. Just you and I, forever we'll be free. Our love will not die, we'll keep it that way.
Well, my first memories of jazz aren't that early. I was playing in brass bands and concert bands and never really thought of any of that as jazz, even though I was playing it as a youngster. But at art school I got into sculpture and was playing music a lot and was introduced to free improvised music, which was avant-garde jazz, really. I was so passionate about avant-garde music and performance, joined what was called the MIA, which was the Melbourne Improvisers Association. They were some of the best players in Melbourne that were into avant-garde music. So I joined up, went to their meetings and found that they were the angriest, most aggressive bunch of people I'd ever met in my life. And I remember after 2 months, I was so stressed. I was driving around Melbourne and my eye had a tick in it thinking about the meeting, seriously. And I was cursing myself and the whole thing, and there was a meeting on that afternoon. And I thought, oh, bugger it, I'm worn out, I'm not going to go to that meeting. And then someone contacted me, or I contacted someone else in the group the next day and asked them what the outcome was, and they said, oh, you got a gig, they're putting you on the program. And as it turned out, the one person that I'd butted heads with the most was the guy that stood up and said we should give him a gig. It was a bit of a shock. This year, it's the slowest year in music I've had in about 4 years. I think I'm down to, maybe only 4 or 5 bands at the moment, whereas the last 2 years before that I was in a rotation of 10 different bands in Newcastle. It was quite stressful for a while. I went to Germany to do the workshops with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in Curtin when he was still alive. I think that was, I don't know, I can't remember what year it was, it might have been late 90s. Favourite avant-garde musician, because his music was just so, I guess, difficult to appreciate. My influences for jazz were different for different styles and different eras. In the avant-garde music, there was a crazy trombone player called Roswell Rudd, who I read years later, they talked about him, that he sounded like he was playing tailgate trombone on a space station, which is 1920s style avant-garde. But there are lots of crazy musicians in that era. Laurie Anderson was a performance artist who influenced me there.
Excellent stone. Here it comes. Watch it fall.
As well as the art ensemble of Chicago. And that list goes on and on. But in trad jazz and early jazz, it started off with Kid Ory and Henri Dutré, who were early trombone players, as well as Louis and all the other standards. Jelly Roll Morton was a big influence. And then someone gave me a tape with Jack Teagarden on it, and that blew my mind, really. I don't think I've seen James Morrison live, but I remember seeing a clip on an interview years ago, and it gave me so much more respect for him. He was talking about personal practice, and like he's been at the top end of the world in jazz trumpet for a long, long time, and he said a thing that I'll never forget. He said, with your practice and your performance, if you miss a day, you know. If you miss 2 days practice in a row, the band knows, and if you miss 3 days in a row, the audience knows. And I thought, well, if that worked for him, imagine how it must apply to me. I play the trombone. I've been playing it since I was 8 years old, which was a long time. I went crazy about them for a time. I think in a year and a half I bought about 32 or 33. I found one and it just opened the floodgates and went on. What I'd read about over that time was the search for the Holy Grail, which is the perfect 2B or small bore jazz trombone. The dearest ones are the ones I bought brand new, which is they aren't vintage at all. I've got a 93 King anniversary model Silver Sonic, which is a solid sterling bell. That was $2,200 in 93. And my recent purchase, which is a vintage style boutique trombone from Germany. When I was in Melbourne in my early 20s, a lot of the guys that I was playing trad jazz with were becoming multi-instrumentalists, and I just figured at that stage I wasn't good enough on one, let alone trying to play many. But at the same time, I did have a clarinet and a couple of trumpets and a few other things. And there was one stage where I was in a small country town in Victoria and black banned from playing music. So I decided it was time to learn to play the guitar and write songs. So for 30 weeks I did open mic nights and wrote a song every week for 30 weeks. And that fulfilled my need to perform at least and to play. Well, the Louis Armstrong voice was just a choice. I just wanted to sound like that when I sang. I was a Tom Waits fan and a Louis fan. And it took a while to just get in a situation where I could basically keep singing till I broke it and keep singing, which is how I developed it. I was driving from Melbourne to Newcastle and decided I was going to use that trip to make my singing voice work. So I started singing in Melbourne, and I remember about Wagga, I was so hoarse I couldn't sing anymore, and I just kept singing till I got to Sydney, and it kind of broke it and fixed it all in the one trip. Seven years ago, I think now, my sister and I had been trying to get a band going together to play old style jazz for quite a while, and it was impossible to get a band together, so we just got a gig, and the people that run the venue gave us 2 months to get a band together, and we threw together a band with a half a dozen songs, and the next week got a phone call for a real Sunday Arvo jazz gig, and haven't looked back since then. My sister's background in music, I remember as a kid she was having singing lessons while she was doing ballet. She'd come through local theatre, I think the Young People's Theatre and those sorts of things in Newcastle. And then later on in life, become a singer in like a dance techno kind of outfit, and worked with a couple of, like a recording engineer and a successful songwriter, and had a few tunes that ended up on television in background music and things like that. But has always had an interest in jazz. We've been wanting to get this outfit of ours together for a long time, really. So I was at a rehearsal a few years ago for a Zoe K gig and met Shane Landry, who's our clarinet player, at that gig, and before the rehearsal was over I'd booked him for a gig that weekend with the band, and he's been in the band ever since, and he's such a great asset to us. His musicianship and his knowledge and his professionalism that he brings to the band have been the thing that's actually helped bring the band to the next level, I think. I've had others come to fill in that are great saxophone players, but the clarinet's pretty much a neglected instrument in modern jazz around here. So there's very few tenor players that carry the clarinet to the equal level, whereas I think with Half Nelson it's helped Shane keep up with the clarinet. The piano player, Carter Smythe, who's a great little find. I did a gig with him with another band for the first night of NEMA, which is the Newcastle Improvised Music Association, maybe 3 years ago. And it was actually a band of an ex-guitarist of ours, Martin Rotolo, who was back up from Melbourne, put together a band with a few charts. And I knew from that gig that if I could ever get that piano player into our band, he'd be a great asset, just because of his feel and the way he played, his understatement, and that he wasn't a totally modern player. And it took him a little while to settle in, but he's really proved that he was a good pick as well. Our bass player, Chris Dawson, was another great find from just going out and playing with other bands and other musicians. And his touch on the double bass in the early 20s style was just so fantastic. That it's one of those things, sometimes you're fishing for a player, you ask them, and they say yes, and you just go on from there. Dave Tracy, our drummer, and his counterpart, David Jones, are both fantastic musicians. With all of them, the band's been now pretty much a set lineup for nearly 3 years, and that's been making a big difference to the way the band sounds, I think, from here on in. Well, the Duke Jam Start I picked up just through reading jazz history, biographies, autobiographies, old accounts, where it just seems to come up in book after book that there was a thing that Duke did, which, as I've mentioned before, for me paralleled my interest in free improvised music. As far as trying to emulate that fall in beginning that Duke had, no, we haven't been that successful at it. We've had to actually write our own little section to make it work. The way Ellington's orchestra used to start, no, not given any reason why, but apparently he used to just sit at the piano and he'd continually write songs and finesse charts in the breaks, and he would just be plunking away and the band would just turn up whenever they felt like it. The bass player might sit in and start playing, and then maybe a horn player or a horn section will drop in, and they would just vamp through these cycles, and then all of a sudden they would just slip into a tune without any real notice, and it would just be this smooth introduction, which really I took to because I'd spent years playing free improvised music, and that type of music is all about your segues from section to section and getting those smooth transitions. To me, it's the most exciting thing I'd ever heard. That concept was going on, and I fantasise about why it even existed, given that how hard a life they all lived. I would imagine that half the band are in the bar down the road or in the back room doing something they shouldn't have been doing. And it wasn't worth the headache to try and get the band all together at the one time. So
Trying to round up 20 blokes.
yeah, and Duke seemed like he was pretty together with those sorts of things. He wouldn't waste his energy on trying to sort something like that. He'd just find a smart way around it.
Do you think many jazz bands could?
Yeah,
Like that?
yeah. It's just it's exposure as much as anything else. When I was in Melbourne playing with the trad guys down there, who were a lot of young and experimental musicians who just happened to like 1920s jazz as well, they could have done it at the drop of a hat without any preparation. But the guys we have, it's not a comfort zone for them. I have no doubt they could do it.
Yeah.
But it would just take a while to get in sync with that. At the moment, they're still working with the parameters of the music that we have. You've got to have a mindset for it, that's for sure. I know with the free improvised bands, I got to a point where I would hand-pick the musicians to just to have the right nature to play like that, really. But that wouldn't have been a different case with Duke. I think with Duke, they were in an era where you played so much. You were just, your bottom line was so much higher than most people's anyway. The way I look at it is there's certain times where there is just the perfect line for you to play, and sometimes both of you think of that exactly the same time. Cool, man.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Joe.
just hope some of it makes sense. Listen to this sounds great. Well, my other great love in life is surfing. Surfing has been one of the things that I've been doing for a long, long time as well. Surfboards, 36 of them, from 60s males all the way through to a brand new board last Christmas. Yeah, I collected them for a long, long time. When I lived up the East End in Newcastle in the late 80s, I was going to art school, playing in a band, doing lots of sleeping in, and surfed every day, and found that it's still there, from tank traps at Southie all the way to the harbour. There's 20 different breaks you can ride. About 15 years ago in Victoria, I was surfing. I watched this dude paddle from the other end of the beach, like way off in the distance, all the way up. Big smile on his face, caught a few waves, hung around for a while, then paddled right down the other end of the beach. And about 10 or 15 minutes later, I realised that guy was about 70 and still having the time of his life. And I thought, well, yeah, that'll be me, hopefully, too.